In today's video, we will be replacing the upper and lower control arms, front shocks, and sway bar links. First, we will tackle the upper control arm. It is attached to the steering knuckle through the ball joint and fastened with a pinch bolt. The inboard portion of the control arm is attached to the frame with 2 pivot bolts. To gain access to the pivot bolts, remove the splash guard. Since this one is so old and rotted, it will be replaced, so I'm not worried about ripping it up when I take it off. One tip to make your life easier is to spray some penetrating oil on all the hardware before disassembly. Put a jack in place to support the steering knuckle. Remove the pinch bolt and place the jack in a position that allows the bolt to be easily removed. The bolt and nut are 15 millimeter. With some persuasion, you should be able to remove the ball joint from the steering knuckle. This is why it is important to have the knuckle supported by the jack. Next, find the sketchiest bungee cord you can find to support the top of the knuckle. Break the torque on both pivot bolts and remove. They are 21 millimeter. Once the pivot bolts are removed, you can remove the upper control arm. Now it's time to install the new one. This may take some persuasion because of the new bushings. Line up the control arm bushings with the slots in the frame before trying to reinstall the bolts. A good way to do this is to install one pivot bolt backwards, since it's easier. Then install the bolt in the correct direction. You can also wrap the sketchy bungee cord around the ball joint to support the weight, making it easier to install the bolts. Once the hardware is installed, be sure to inspect the area with a mirror to ensure that the washers are lined up properly and bottomed on the frame. But don't torque the pivot bolts yet. You can also use the mirror to help line up the bushings. Position the ball joint into the steering knuckle. You may have to move the jack up and down to find the sweet spot. A plastic mallet is great for persuasion. Install the pinch bolt and torque to 30 to 41 foot-pounds. Now to torque the pivot bolts. Raise the knuckle to normal ride height with the jack, then torque to 83 to 112 foot-pounds. Now to replace the lower control arm, we have to remove the shock. If you're not replacing your shock, you can just disconnect it from the lower control arm. But since we are replacing the shocks, we'll remove it completely. The bottom nuts are 13 millimeter. The upper shock housing hex is 18 millimeter, and the upper nut is 15 millimeter. Next, we will remove the sway bar links, something else we're going to replace. The sway bar link is a glorified bolt, really. Just a bolt hex at the top with a bunch of bushings, a spacer, and a nut at the bottom. And honestly, I forgot what size the nut and the bolt are, but you'll figure it out. A good tip is to rest a wrench on the steering knuckle. That way you have two hands to break the torque on the nut below the bottom control arm. This truck has a torsion bar spring. It is routed through the lower control arm and attached to the frame using a torsion key. To remove the torsion bar, we must remove the adjuster bolt. This bolt adds or decreases tension on the torsion bar. This tension dictates ride height, but more on that later. Remove the torsion bar cover plate. Now you can see the torsion bar key and the adjuster nut. Install a 2-jar puller or torsion bar tool to relieve pressure on the adjuster nut. The puller pushes up on the key, allowing you to be able to pull the nut out of the crossmember. Make sure to install the tool into the divot of the key. It's a good idea to mark the torsion bar for ease of installation. When installed, the adjuster bolt pushes up on the key, increasing torsion bar tension. This tension pushes the tire down, counteracting the weight of the vehicle. Release the tension on the puller and remove the key and torsion bar. On top of the key is an isolator, and the blue material helps isolate the torsion bar from the frame, and it makes a huge mess. Both ends of the torsion bar are hex-shaped, allowing full engagement into the key and lower control arm. To the left of the torsion bar receptacle, you will see the forward pivot bolt. And here is the aft pivot bolt. They are 13/16 and they have captive nuts. Remove the lower ball joint cotter key and the 15/16 nut. But leave the nut in place. You'll see why in a second. Loosen the pivot bolts. The nuts are held in place with captive tabs. Place the jack under the control arm and allow room for the knuckle to swing down. Persuade the ball joint by hitting the nut we left in place with a hammer. Once it pops loose, use the jack to finish the removal and be sure to support the knuckle. Remove the pivot bolts and the old, tired, and worn out control arm. Time for retirement, buddy. Install the replacement control arm. Reinstall the pivot bolts snugly, but do not torque them yet. Place the lower ball joint into the knuckle. A little wiggle wiggle always helps. Replace the nut and torque to 83 to 113 foot-pounds. Install a new cotter key, making sure it does not extend beyond the nut and contact the tire. Install the shock. And make sure that the lower mount is turned properly. Install the nuts and torque to 15 to 21 foot-pounds. Tighten the upper nut until bottomed. Install the new sway bar link and torque to 15 to 21 foot-pounds. Reinstall the torsion bar and make sure it engages the control arm properly. Install the key. Place the isolator on top of the key and install the puller onto the cross member and key. Notice when the tension is increased on the key, the knuckle in the background is forced down. Now I had a little trouble, so I had to reposition the puller for a second go. Install the adjuster bolt nut and release the tension on the puller. Reinstall the cover plate and reinstall the bolt with blue Loctite on the threads. Reinstall the tire and torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Finally, with the weight of the vehicle on the tires, we can now torque the pivot bolts to 111 to 148 foot-pounds. To set ride height, measure the middle of the lower control arm pivot bolt to the ground. Now measure the lowest point of the steering knuckle. The center of the pivot bolt should be 4 inches higher than the bottom of the steering knuckle. Simply tighten the adjuster bolt until you reach the desired height. Always make height adjustments with the weight off the tire so you don't strip the nut. Drive a short distance to settle the suspension. Come back and measure again. Do this until the pivot bolt is consistently at the desired height.